When Soviet forces withdraw from Eastern Europe, from the Warsaw Pact collapses, when the Baltics and the Ukraine and Belarus all declare their independence, that dramatically changes the security situation in Europe, and I think justifies the United States and the UK and others in taking steps to reduce our conventional forces devoted to that possible conflict in Europe.
I'd just like to range over, I'd like to start out on Mr. Bush, not on the specifics of last night, but a general question. And then get swiftly in. Despite the fact the last time you were through was in such very different circumstances.
John, if you could just continue
Amazing.
chatting in a serious vein for 2 shots.
Sure, yes. This is just to establish the fact that you've been good enough to see us in person, and it's a very timely and useful chance to talk to you about the issues that preoccupy, I think, both. Mr. Secretary, we are in a period perhaps almost like the end of the Second World War in a way, the end of the Cold War, and now looking to a whole new phase, a whole new arrangement, still a potentially dangerous world. Do you have any concern that perhaps rather like Churchill was treated by the British after the Second World War, conceivably that the American electorate will be looking for a new sense of direction, a younger president?
I don't think so. Of course, I'm a strong supporter of President Bush's. I work for him. I'm a Republican. I think he has provided outstanding leadership for the nation, for the entire world, in a very difficult time, and I think the American people recognize that, understand it, and will support him for re-election.
This does seem to be a very difficult time for him, though.
Well, it's the nature of the business, I guess, that there are ups and downs in the political world. A few months ago, the president was at all-time record high standing in the polls. No president had ever been close to 90% approval rating. Now he's back in the normal range where most presidents spend most of their careers, but I think the support of the country will be there, I think, especially when it comes time for the voters to sit down and make a choice and decide between two specific alternatives. One of the most significant events of our election campaign this year, of course, is that most of the candidates on the Democratic side with stature have decided not to run, not to get into the contest. That says something about their overall assessment of the possibility of winning.
Few people work closer to Mr. Bush than you. Are you worried that he does rather overdo it?
He's a man who has great enthusiasm for life and for his work. He never does anything halfway, whether it's in the Oval Office or out on the tennis courts or on the golf course. He's very aggressive, very actively involved. And he, I think in this last go-around in Japan, perhaps overdid it a bit, but I think he understands that.
You kept very careful observation on the old Soviet Union. You had a very sophisticated network of intelligence which enabled you to publish these amazing documents which listed everything they had. Now we're in this much more uncertain time. Are you confident that you know what's happening there and the kind of threat that it poses to the West?
No, not completely. I think we know a lot. I think we have a better access today to what's going on inside the Soviet Union than ever before. It's a much more open society. They are much more open in their discussions with us. When I express something less than total confidence, it really has to do with being able to project the future. There's much less certainty about how their political arrangements are going to evolve over time, how large their forces are going to be, who's going to control their forces, whether they'll be controlled from the center or controlled by the republics, the pace of investment in new weapon systems and modernization of their forces and so forth. Those are all questions that are more difficult to predict today in this current environment, although I do think we have better access to what is going on inside the Soviet Union today.
But what's happening in the Black Sea, for example, I mean, do you think that's all just posturing, or could it end in tears?
No, it's not just posturing by any means. I think this debate that's currently underway over who controls the military assets of the former Soviet Union is an extraordinarily important one. It is sort of the first major challenge to the new political structure that they've tried to establish in the Commonwealth. It is vital in part because the military infrastructure was the most important thing that the former Soviet Union had. And how these issues get resolved will say a lot about their capacity to conduct peaceful relations among themselves in the years ahead. And finally, of course, all of this debate is taking place atop a stockpile of some 25 or 30,000 nuclear weapons. And the question of who controls the Black Sea Fleet could easily be translated at some point into a question of who owns certain strategic systems. For now, they appear to have an agreement to maintain centralized control over their nuclear systems. That appears to be holding up today, but clearly there's major dispute over the future of conventional forces.
Yet you and Mr. Bush are looking to deliver the peace dividend to the American and the Western people in general. Isn't this a time for saying, well, perhaps actually this is potentially a more unstable period than anything that we've had recently, and this is a time, in fact, not to be cutting very much in the way of weaponry?
I think it's a time for caution and prudence. I think it's important that as we make reductions, and we are making reductions, that we do it based only upon changed circumstances in the security environment. The kind of thing, for example, that happens when Soviet forces withdraw from Eastern Europe, from the Warsaw Pact collapses, when the Baltics and the Ukraine and Belarus all declare their independence, that dramatically changes the security situation in Europe, and I think justifies the United States and the UK and others in taking steps to reduce our conventional forces devoted to that possible conflict in Europe. As we see the economic collapse of the former Soviet Union, I think that also will allow us to make some judgments about how large a force they'll be able to field in the future and about how rapidly they will modernize that force, bring new systems online, and that in turn can affect some of our own decisions in that regard. But there's no doubt but what the situation inside the former Soviet Union, the prospects for instability, for civil strife and unrest are greater today than they've been in a long time. But at the same time, their capacity to project conventional power beyond their borders, to do the kind of thing they did in Afghanistan or Czechoslovakia or Hungary in the past, is significantly diminished.
Tomorrow you go on to Germany. Are you concerned that in a still potentially dangerous world, Europe seems to be speaking with several different voices?
I don't know that it should be any different than it's ever been. I think the kind of debate we see in Europe viewed from the perspective of the United States is basically very healthy. It's a natural part of the ending of the division of Europe, of the process that's well underway now towards integration. The kinds of debates we saw at Maastricht and that we've seen over the questions of European security identity and NATO's role in the future of the WEU and EC and so forth are all a normal, healthy part of a group of sovereign democratic states deciding what course they want to follow in the future.
But within that you've got the Germany that you wanted to see strengthened, perhaps strengthening even beyond what people expected. A Germany that is beginning to identify perhaps a separate foreign policy from the rest of Europe. One thinks of Croatia, the rush to recognize Ukraine and the independent states in the Soviet Union. That doesn't worry you, that we could be looking at a newly vital Germany?
Well, I think it is a newly vital Germany, but I don't think that's all bad. I think the reunification of Germany within NATO has been a goal that we've all sought for a long time. I don't think it's surprising that we do have these kinds of debates over what kinds of policies ought to be pursued. The circumstances have changed in Europe. The Soviets are getting out. The Cold War is ended. And I think we have to be flexible enough and imaginative enough in our policies and creative enough to be able to take advantage of the new opportunities that presents. Clearly, there are going to be major debates over how we ought to proceed, but I don't see any threat to the basic fundamental principles that are driving Europe, for example, in the direction of integration. I don't see any challenge to the fundamental notions of democracy, respect for human rights, that has been the hallmark, really, of Western European cooperation now for 40-some years. And I think the coalition, the alliance, the relationships among the North Atlantic nations is strong enough so that we can tolerate those kinds of developments.
Mr. Yeltsin seems to be happy to go to New York at the end of the month for this summit that John Major has suggested as in his position as chair of the G7. Do you think a lot can be got out of talking face-to-face with Mr. Yeltsin in the context of the other key members of the Security Council?
I think so. I'm inclined to think the Prime Minister's suggestion is a good one, and that it's useful to get the heads of government of the UN Security Council together, especially with Mr. Yeltsin. He's been through some fairly traumatic times in Russia. We have not seen him since before the coup last August, although there have been a lot of telephone calls back and forth, a lot of messages passed. I think it's always helpful, and if he can find a way to get to the States at the end of the month and to participate at such a session of the United Nations, I think that would be a very positive development.
Mr. Secretary, thank you very much indeed for talking to us.
Thank you.